Okay, hi everyone. Today we will listen to Dr. Rodney Holder from Cambridge University Faraday Institute. He is both physicist, mathematician, and also he's interested in religion and science and religion and the intersection of those. We met this year with Dr. Holder in Istanbul, so it was a great honor for me. And today he will talk about a subject which is also interesting for me, which is did the universe have a beginning and does it matter? So thank you, Dr. Holder, please.
Thank you, Emre, for your introduction. So do I go back to share screen now? Is that, there we go. What? Yes, so that's my topic, and I'll explain just where I'm going. How do I advance my slides? Sorry, this is not a, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, there we go. Can everyone see that? Is that all right? Is my,
yeah, we can see it. We can
good,
see it.
good. Okay. So did the universe have a beginning and does it matter? So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the Big Bang. That's a little bit similar to what I did in Istanbul a couple of months ago, perhaps slightly expanded. And then ask the question, what do we make of the beginning? Then look at what scientific reactions to the beginning have been, some paradoxes of infinity, then to speak about God as creator and what that means and how that is expounded in traditions. I do speak as a Christian, but I think there's a great deal of commonality here between the Abrahamic faiths. And I'm going to ask what an ultimate explanation is, and the big question, why is there something rather than nothing, and discuss what kind of explanation God provides. Right, so on the 25th of November 1915, Albert Einstein presented to the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin a new theory of gravity. And this was general relativity, and it was to succeed Newton's theory of gravity. Now, in 1917, Einstein obtained a solution to his equations, and that gave a static universe, one which had an infinite past and was the same on into the future. To do that, he had to include a term in his equations called the cosmological constant, but not only that, he had to set it to a particular value, and he was later to call that his greatest blunder. Now there's Einstein. You can see him on the left of that picture. The person on the right is much less well known, but he is a truly great cosmologist, or was. That is Georges Lemaitre. He was a Belgian Roman Catholic priest, and he said on one occasion, there are two ways to truth, and I have chosen them both, meaning both science and religion. He saw no contradiction between them. In the academic year 1923 to 24, Lemaitre came to Cambridge to study with Sir Arthur Eddington, who had just a couple of years before that verified one of the main predictions of Einstein's general relativity, the bending of starlight by the sun. Now, in 1927, Lemaitre obtained a solution of Einstein's equations which predicted the universe's expansion. It was an expansion from Einstein's static universe. He showed that that was unstable, and therefore the universe would change over time. It would expand from this static universe. Now, there was a Russian, Alexander Friedmann, who had obtained solutions of Einstein's equations a few years before. The difference between Friedmann and Lemaitre was that Friedmann thought this was just a mathematical game. Lemaitre thought he was dealing with a model that really described the universe. Now, in 1929, the expansion was observed by Hubble in the US at the Mount Wilson Observatory in California. Now, there was already some data going back a few years before Lemaitre from a chap called Vesto Slipher showing that the nebulae were moving apart. And Lemaitre, in his model, predicted the rate of expansion. He calculated what subsequently came to be known as the Hubble constant, the velocity at which the galaxies are receding is proportional to their distance from us. Now, that was called the Hubble law after Hubble discovered the expansion and drew the graph on the basis of his observations. And in 2017, interestingly enough, that was renamed the Hubble-Lemaitre law by the International Astronomical Union. It had been predicted by Lemaitre. Now, the year 1931 saw a new solution from Lemaitre in which not only does the universe expand, but it expands now from a very dense, compact initial state, which Lemaitre called the primeval atom. He had a theory that this was like a radioactive decay. This this particle, this huge, massive particle, well, of course it was highly compact, decayed, and that gave us the universe's expansion. And everything followed from that. So this was the first real Big Bang theory that, as I say, Lemaitre called it the primeval atom. It had the two components of starting from a compact initial state and expanding. The term Big Bang was coined in 1949 by another Cambridge cosmologist called Fred Hoyle. Fred Hoyle actually hated the idea. He was an atheist. He really disliked the idea that as you track back the history of the universe, it came to a beginning. Physics ran out. So the Big Bang was really a term of abuse for him. Now, the Big Bang theory is very well supported by the evidence, predicted by Lemaitre, and well supported by the evidence, especially the expansion, of course. Now, Hoyle and a couple of colleagues in Cambridge, Herman Bondi and Thomas Gold, came up with an alternative, which they called the steady state theory, which explained the expansion by saying that new matter came into existence in the space between the galaxies as they move apart, as the space takes them apart. And that new matter came into existence at just the right rate for the universe to stay looking the same. They had to postulate a particular rate of creation of new matter, something like an atom per 100 years in a building the size of, when I was in Istanbul, I said the Blue Mosque, or it might be St. Paul's Cathedral in London, some huge building. And that rate of creation of matter was below any possible observational threshold. In 1965, the cosmic background radiation was observed. This had been predicted in 1948 by American cosmologists. They thought, well, if the universe starts highly, if you track back the history of the universe, it would have been very hot near the beginning. And it would leave, as it expanded, this radiation at a very low temperature. They predicted something like 5 degrees above absolute zero. It turns out to be about 3 degrees above absolute zero. And this was observed by these characters, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson at Bell Telephone Laboratories. The story goes that they thought they'd got bird droppings in their antenna. What they'd actually got was the remnant radiation from the origin of the universe. And they had to be told that by cosmologists, and they got the Nobel Prize for that remarkable discovery. And interestingly, Lemaitre just discovered, well, was informed of that on his deathbed, just a few days before he was dying. He was informed of that confirmatory discovery, because that radiation could not be predicted on the basis of the steady state theory. It really ruled out the steady state. It was explained in a natural way and already predicted on the basis of the Big Bang. Now, it seems to me that there are two fundamental questions which cosmology raises that relate, possibly anyway, to theology. One is this one, that the universe began to exist, and the other is that the universe appears fine-tuned for life. Now, when I was in Istanbul, I dealt with the second question. I think there's a very strong argument for God being behind the universe, given its fine-tuning, and I'm going to argue in a similar way about the universe beginning to exist. That's today's topic. It's been resisted by many cosmologists, like I've mentioned Hoyle, Bondi, and Gold, but also Stephen Hawking, and someone called Lawrence Krauss, who thinks the universe can create itself from nothing. And I'm going to deal with some of the things that they say. But I want to now ask, what do we make of the beginning? What have theologians said? I have a couple of very significant Christian theologians here who've commented on the creation and what they think about the creation. This is Clement of Alexandria, flourished around about 200 in the Common Era, and he said this. He said, "How could creation take place in time, seeing time was born along with things which exist?" So time, space, and matter come into existence together. That's the idea. Think of Augustine of Hippo, another couple of hundred years later, is better known for saying the same thing. And what he said was, if the sacred and its fallible scriptures say that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, then assuredly the world was made not in time, but simultaneously with time. And yeah, so he further said, with the motion of creatures, time began to run its course. It's idle to look for time before creation, as if time can be found before time. We should therefore say that time began with creation rather than that creation began with time, but both are from God. For from him and through him and in him are all things. And in another place he says this: he made that which gave time its beginning as he made all things together, disposing them in an order based not on intervals of time, but on causal connections. And thus the creatures which were made all at once could be shown in their perfection by the sixfold repetition of the day of creation. That's a complicated passage, but what is clear is one thing, that he doesn't take the 6 days of creation in the first chapter of the Bible literally. Rather, the creation was to unfold thanks to what he calls causal connections. Otherwise, in other places, he calls these seed-like principles, which God has implanted in the creation at the beginning. And all this, interestingly enough, is entirely compatible with the Big Bang theory. Of course, Augustine and Clement could not have known about the Big Bang theory, but their ideas of creation, based on their meditation on what the scriptures said and their philosophical reflection, led them to talk about time and space and matter coming into existence together. Now, as you will all know, I think, one important argument that has been made in philosophy, and it's been revivified due to the discovery of the Big Bang, is based on the idea of the universe having a beginning. So today, in the Christian world, the most forceful expression of this argument, I think, is being made by philosopher William Lane Craig. He's a Protestant Christian. There's also a Roman Catholic Christian, Robert Spitzer, who's done similar work. So the Kalam cosmological argument, then, it says that everything that the premises are, everything that begins to exist has a cause of its existence. The universe began to exist, and the conclusion that therefore the universe has a cause of its existence. Now, presented like that, the argument is a logical proof. If one accepts the premises, then the conclusion follows by inexorable logic. The first premise seems very reasonable. Things don't come into existence without a prior cause. Things just don't appear from nothing. As I'll say again when talking about Lawrence Krauss, even the vacuum in quantum theory is not nothing. And premise 2 seems to be exactly what the Big Bang theory says. Everything that begins to exist, the universe began to exist. So therefore the universe has a cause of its existence. Now, I think there are reasons, both scientific and theological, about drawing an absolutely definitive conclusion from this. I think I would prefer to see it as an argument which makes creation by God much more probably true than it would otherwise be, rather than as a logical proof, which is how it is portrayed by William Lane Craig. And I'll explain why I think that. I think it is a strong argument, but I think there are some let-out clauses. So, scientific reactions to the beginning. Well, we've already seen the steady state theory. Bondi, Gould, and Hoyle came up with that. And they were atheists who had an atheistic motivation. And they, interestingly enough, Bondi and Gould proposed something called the perfect cosmological principle, which says that apart from local irregularities, the universe presents the same aspect at all times and at all places, any place and any time. Now that goes beyond the earlier cosmological principle, which simply says that the universe looks uniform from anywhere within it, any spatial point within it. That is actually quite useful because it helps us get some of the simplest solutions to Einstein's equations. And indeed, the universe does look very homogeneous in that sense. But this is to say that it's the same over time as well. And that's a prior assumption that they made, and then they'd derive a model based on that. Now, although the steady state theory fell with the discovery of the cosmic background, it does have to be acknowledged that there are problems with the beginning. What happens as one goes further back in time towards the beginning is that the physics gets less secure, and eventually you end up, if you take the standard time evolution equations of general relativity, ignore quantum theory, the universe ends up at a singularity, which is a point of infinite density and temperature. It's a point where physics breaks down, and many physicists find that uncomfortable. Now, as I should explain, there are some theories which try and get round that problem. It has to be said, they're highly speculative, since we have no agreed theory which combines quantum theory with general relativity, which is what's needed to handle the regimes in question right near the very beginning. Now, one of these theories is due to Stephen Hawking and his colleague James Hartle. According to the Hartle-Hawking theory, as you track back time towards the beginning, time becomes imaginary in the technical sense of complex numbers. What that actually means in practice is that time it becomes like another space dimension. And this four-dimensional space has no boundary or edge, rather like a three-dimensional sphere. The four-dimensional space has no boundary or edge. And this is what Hawking called the no boundary proposal, and it reappears in his book. It's there first in A Brief History of Time. It reappears in a book later, The Grand Design, co-authored with Leonard Molodinov. Interestingly, Hawking seems to agree with Elaine Craig that if the universe had a beginning, it would need God to create it. Earlier work of Hawking, interesting enough, was on singularity theorems, which showed that the universe really does possess a singularity on the basis of the straight Big Bang theory, and he proved theorems with colleague Roger Penrose on that. But now he has this new idea, and what he says is this. There would be no singularities at which the laws of science broke down, and no edge of space-time at which one would have to appeal to God or some new law to set the boundary conditions for space-time. One could say the boundary condition of the universe is that it has no boundary. The universe would be completely self-contained and not affected by anything outside itself. It would neither be created nor destroyed. It would just be. That's one thing he says, and he goes on to say, so long as the universe had a beginning, we could suppose that it had a creator. But if the universe is really completely self-contained, having no boundary or edge, it would have neither beginning nor end. It would simply be. What place then for a creator? In The Grand Design, Hawking says the same thing. A universe with no beginning in time has no need for God to light the blue touch paper and set it going. That's when you set a rocket going into the air, light the blue touch paper. I think that there's a mistake there anyway, that if you did away, and I'll come back to that later, if you do away with God at the beginning, do you do away with the place of God? altogether, as it were. And I think the answer to that is no. But with this proposal, there are serious scientific and philosophical problems, and not least is the idea of imaginary time, time becoming a space dimension. So what is the meaning of imaginary time and the Euclidean four-dimensional space, which embraced it prior? And of course, it's difficult to talk about these terms, prior in some doubtful sense to the emergence of real time. Well, Hawking is very ambivalent about this. He says either imaginary and real time are convenient mathematical devices, or maybe imaginary time was real and real time our own invention. Or his more considered view, I think, it is meaningless to ask which is real, since they both exist only in our minds, and it's only a matter of which is the more useful description. This is Hawking's philosophy of so-called model-dependent realism, and it is really a non-realism. It's an instrumentalism that all you're interested is in the mathematics, which matches observation, but you're not necessarily describing physical reality. That actually means that we have options here. We can indeed take real time to be real time and imaginary time to be just a mathematical device. You see, it's very difficult to see how, if there is a four-dimensional space, one can evolve from that. The universe might just be, as Hawking puts it, but how could it ever be anything than what it is in that spatialized time era? Time, real time, measures change. Space doesn't do that. So it's as when our equations give solutions of infinite density and so on. So when they make time imaginary, the usual thing is to regard something as wrong, or that as to be unphysical, perhaps just a mathematical device that's useful. And indeed, we don't accept, as I say, don't have to accept Hawking's philosophy. We can take real time as ontologically real and not imaginary time. And then the universe would begin. And Hawking, indeed, in his technical papers, as opposed to the popular books, says this. The universe actually begins in this model, although it doesn't begin from a singularity, a point of infinite density and temperature. It begins where, if you like, the four-dimensional space and the dimensions of three spatial dimensions and one of time intersect. So it starts from a finite size, a sphere of finite size, the real universe. So, in fact, the reality is Hawking, with this model, has failed to avoid a temporal beginning to the universe. And then what we have to reckon with is newer singularity theorems that have come in more recent times than Hawking and Penrose back in the late 60s and 70s, which are much more general, from this colleague of Hawking, Alexander Vilenkin. Now, back in the year 2012, there was a symposium in Cambridge to celebrate Stephen Hawking's 70th birthday. The sad thing was that Hawking had to go into hospital while the symposium was going on. That was something that he had to do because of his illness. But he sent a message to the symposium. If the universe had a beginning, then it would need God to create it. Well, Vilenkin at that symposium displayed his singularity theorems, and he made the classic remark that all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. Now let me move on to another scientist, and talk about quantum vacuum creation. This is a chap called Lawrence Krauss. He has written a book called A Universe from Nothing, where he talks about the universe coming from nothing, but in fact what he does is talk about it coming from a quantum vacuum. A quantum vacuum is not nothing. It's a hive of activity in which particles come into existence and go out of existence. Space is acted on by quantum fields. So you get these particles and antiparticles coming and going. It's a hive of activity. So this nothing of Krauss seems to be a rather sophisticated something. Krauss himself says at one point that nothing is unstable. Well, nothing in the philosophical sense has any properties at all, let alone being stable or unstable. It's a confusion. And I have an analogy, and I don't know whether you're familiar with this book, Through the Looking Glass. This is Lewis Carroll and with Alice in Wonderland, and then Through the Looking Glass. And I have an analogy for what Krauss is doing in that book. Here's a quote from Through the Looking Glass. "I see nobody on the road," said Alice. "Only wish I had such eyes," the king remarked in a fretful tone, "to be able to see nobody, and that distance too." "Who did you pass on the road?" the king went on, holding out his hand to the messenger. "Nobody," said the messenger. "Quite right," said the king. "This young lady saw him too." "So, of course, nobody walks slower than you." "Well, I do my best," the messenger said in a sullen tone. "I'm sure nobody walks much faster than I do." "He can't do that," said the king, "or else he'd have been here first." Now, this convoluted and getting more and more confused conversation is confused because it confuses nobody in the sense of nobody at all, no person at all, with a Mr. Nobody, with a capital N, a somebody called nobody. And I think that that is rather like what Lawrence Krauss and others are saying when they say that the universe created itself out of nothing. It's misleading. Now, I'm going to move on to paradoxes of infinity. There are quite a number of these, but I've just picked out three. I did mention this one in Istanbul in May. Hilbert's hotel has infinitely many rooms. They are all full. And a new guest arrives. Well, actually, we can create infinitely many free rooms simply by moving the person in room 1 to room 2, the one in room 2 to room 4, the one in room 3 to room 6, room 4 to room 8, and so on and so on. In fact, that creates infinitely many spare rooms. I should say that mathematicians handle infinite sets in a logical way. But the problem arises when we're talking about infinities which are instantiated in the real world rather than the abstract realm of mathematics. Now that paradox is really about a spatial infinity, an infinite quantity of things existing simultaneously rather than an infinite sequence of events. But William Lane Craig thinks that, well, that doesn't matter. You can put these sets into one-to-one correspondence, and that's a slightly controversial thing. Here is a genuine paradox to do with sequences of events. Alice has been counting down from minus infinity And she's just coming to these numbers. She's just concluding -3, -2, -1, 0. The question is, why does she end now? Why did she not finish yesterday or the day before, or indeed any particular point in the past, since she's been counting from -infinity? So this argument can be firmed up by invoking the principle of sufficient reason. There must be a sufficient reason why she is ending today rather than any other day, but there doesn't seem to be one. Now, the principle of sufficient reason may not be a necessary truth, but it does, I would argue, a theory that does give a reason is surely to be metaphysically preferred to one that doesn't, that just leaves you puzzled. Then those are mathematical paradoxes, if you like, but there is a physical one, the second law of thermodynamics. That's slightly akin to the previous one. The second law of thermodynamics says that the universe is progressing from a state of order to states of increasing disorder. It's running down. It will eventually suffer a heat death when it reaches thermal equilibrium at a uniform temperature, and there will be no further changes of heat into useful work possible at that point. Now, the question is, if the universe is infinitely old, why hasn't it wound down already? Why do we still have a very substantially ordered universe? Right. My next topic, moving on then, to come back to the theology. I'm rather oscillating between science and theology. How does all that I've said so far tie in with an understanding of the universe as God's creation in the Abrahamic faiths? Well, we've seen something of that with Clement and Augustine, who I quoted earlier. And theologically, indeed, one might think there's great consonance between the two stories, as I said before, the scientific one of the Big Bang and the theological one. Now, the idea that time and space came into existence together, as to Augustine, is related to the idea of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, and to the idea that God created freely. He did not have to create because God is self-sufficient in himself. And the universe is contingent. It may or may not have existed, and it need not be as it is. And I'll say more about that later. Now, this idea of creation contrasts with pagan ideas of creation. Now, many scholars think that the story in the Hebrew Bible in Genesis chapter 1 is reacting to the Babylonian myth, in which an evil goddess is destroyed in battle and her entrails are used to create the heavens and the earth. And the result is that the creation is evil, made from an evil goddess. The great Greek philosopher Plato was a bit more sophisticated than that. He had creation being made by the so-called demiurge or craftsman. Now, the demiurge did not create matter, but molded pre-existent matter. Demiurge aims for the good, but created things are only shadows or imperfect representations of reality, the perfect existing in the abstract world of forms or ideas for Plato. This matter is resistant to the demiurge. So on both these views, the material world could not be said to be good. Now, in Hebrew and Christian thought, which I know most about, the material world is pronounced good by God. And the doctrine of creation can affirm that, because God made matter and didn't just mold it. He made everything out of nothing. This is chapter 1, verse 1 says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And you then get this repetition of God said, let there be, and it was so. Let there be, and it was so. Now, I'm very interested to see here the commonality between the Abrahamic faiths, because the Quran says really exactly the same thing. The Quran at Surah 4:73 says, he it is who created the heavens and the earth in that day when he said, be, it is. So God speaks the creation into existence, and the same is true in Surah 11:7. He it is who created the heavens and the earth. Now, in the Christian world, there is some discussion of whether we're translating or interpreting Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 right. And some scholars think that it can be taken to mean in the beginning when God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void. So it could be taken to mean that God is creating out of pre-existing chaos. Even if that was so, the chapter would show the effortless nature of the creation. There's no resistant matter to God. God says, let there be, and it was so. And there's no cosmic battle of the gods, no resistant matter. Okay. But if that view is correct, then creation out of nothing comes later on. In the book 2 Maccabees, which comes between the Old Testament period and the New Testament period, we have King Antiochus Epiphanes IV, and there is a gruesome story of 7 Jewish brothers who are tortured on the rack because they keep to their Jewish food laws. They won't eat the king's meat. And they're encouraged to stick with that by their mother, who says this, I beseech you, my child, to look at the heaven and the earth and see that everything that is in them, and recognize that God did not make them out of things that existed. And then in the Christian New Testament, we get in St. Paul's letter to the Romans, God who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. So the doctrine is implanted, as it were, in scriptures, but it gets elaborated later on in the 2nd century, famously by Theophilus of Antioch. He has this to say, and what great thing is it if God made the world out of existent materials? For even a human artist, when he gets his material from someone, makes of it what he pleases. But the power of God is manifested in this, that out of things that are not, he makes whatever he pleases. So there's a difference between human making and God's creation. And other theologians have said the same thing, but creation out of nothing, creatio ex nihilo, has become firm in theology. Now, let me just say a few words now back about the science, oscillating backwards and forwards again. So far, all attempts to do away with the beginning have failed. Bondi, Golden, Hoyle, Hartle and Hawking, Krauss. And those had atheistic motivations, and the universe cannot bring itself into existence. it makes sense then for it to be created. But let me go back also to Lemaitre. He actually was very cautious about this. He said that there was no theological inference to be made from his primeval atom. And indeed, he took issue with the Pope in 1951 when the Pope said that the Big Bang proved Genesis 1 to be correct. A very strong and definitive statement made by Pope Pius XII. And Lemaitre demurred at that. He objected. And of course, it has to be said that in 1951, there still was a lot of debate in cosmology with the steady state theory, a definite runner at that point as an alternative. And Lemaitre was worried that people like Fred Hoyle would say, oh, well, there's an ideological motivation, there's a theological motivation for coming up with this theory. And Lemaitre, came up with it for purely scientific reasons. Now, again, it does, as I've said before, it does, however, pose a problem that the laws of physics break down at the singularity. A singularity of infinite density and zero size in physics indicates that new physics is required. So we've got theories, lots of theories on offer, and I looked particularly at the Hartle-Hawking one. There are theories about an infinite universe and of infinitely many universes. There's the so-called inflation theory. Now these it looks as though the ones I've named certainly don't succeed in the light of Vilenkin's theorems, which apply to a wide variety of models. But maybe someday someone will come up with a satisfactory theory. The theories we're talking about here are speculative. We need a theory of quantum gravity that we don't yet have. Now, okay, so the idea of a beginning is troublesome for atheists, but it seems to me that the main lesson from the theological doctrine of creation is that the universe is totally dependent on God for its existence every moment. I hinted at that earlier on when I criticized Hawking for seeming to think the only possible role for God was right at the beginning. That there's no resistant matter over which God does not have control. He is in control. And God continues to uphold the universe in being and interact with its creation. He sustains it in being. And if he was to cease doing that, the universe would collapse into nothing. It needs God moment by moment. And we could call that continuing creation, creatio continua, which is actually another name for the steady state theory that Hoyle came up with. So, it would be compatible, actually, that God creates a universe that is infinite into the past with the idea that he's a creator with no resistant matter, and he's upholding it moment by moment. Here's what Augustine says about this. When a builder puts up a house, his work remains in spite of the fact that he's no longer there, but the universe will pass away in the twinkling of an eye if God withdraws his ruling hand. As Aquinas said, with the essay, the being of all creaturely beings so depends upon God that they could not continue to exist even for a moment, but would fall away into nothingness unless they were sustained in existence by his power. As Gregory puts it, that's Pope Gregory the Great he's talking about. The universe would collapse into nothing unless God upholds it in being. Now, Aquinas recognized that God would be the cause of the universe's existence whether it had a temporal beginning or not. He did believe it had a temporal beginning, but he thought that we only knew that by faith. By faith alone do we hold, and by no demonstration can it be proved that the world did not always exist. So perhaps creation out of nothing is an answer to why is there anything at all, rather than the how did the universe begin. God is needed, even if the universe had an infinite past. And that can be made, that point can be made for looking at Aquinas' 5 ways, his proofs of the existence of God. The idea that there must be a first cause of all things, they're sort of variants on that idea. But it's quite clear that Aquinas means logical rather than temporal causality in that context. There can be an infinite chain of causes going back in time, but that infinite chain needs a cause for its existence. And I'll just go into that in slightly more detail in a moment. But before I do that, let me say that I think, and I stand to be corrected, but it looks to me as though in Islamic scholarship, there's a similar distinction between creation as God causing the temporal beginning of the universe and causing the universe to exist moment by moment, whether or not there was a temporal beginning. So the Kalam cosmological argument is about temporal origin, and a major exponent would be Al-Ghazali. But on the other hand, Avicenna insisted that creation was about ontological origin, not temporal origin. For him, for Avicenna, God is the cause of the universe. He asserts creation out of nothing, but God is the cause of the universe, even though the universe has no temporal origin. For him, creation out of nothing means existential dependence on the creator, not that the universe began to exist after non-existence. And I have that from a book called Creation and the God of Abraham, in which Rahim Akar from Marmara University has a chapter. There are several by Muslim scholars, actually, as well as Christians. Now, let me move on then. I'm looking at my watch, and I think we're all right. So, ultimate explanation. What is by an ultimate explanation, I mean an answer to the question, why is there something rather than nothing? And it seems to be that only God can provide this. And the reason is that God is necessary. God, really by definition, cannot not exist. He is what he is, and there never was when God was not. However you like to express this, God is eternal. God is uncreated. God exists necessarily. Anything that's created is not God. So when someone like Richard Dawkins asks, "Who made God?" then he's misunderstanding the meaning of the term God, because anything created is not God. God exists necessarily, whereas the universe is contingent. Actually, this point has been made, really, I think, very beautifully by none other than Stephen Hawking. At the end of A Brief History of Time, he asked this question, which I think did it very eloquently. What is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? You can have the most wonderful theory, the theory of everything that Hawking was looking for. You can have this mathematics, but why is there a universe to which that applies? Martin Rees, Lord Rees, Ludlow, League of Hawking, astronomer royal in Britain, very senior scientist, says, such questions lie beyond science. They are the province of philosophers and theologians. And it is Dennis Sharma, who was the supervisor of the doctoral theses of both Hawking and Penrose, Rees, at a much humbler level than those characters I had the privilege of being supervised by Sharma myself, an inspiring man. But he made the same point. None of us can understand why there is a universe at all, why anything should exist. That's the ultimate question. Well, Sharma, Hawking, and Rees are or were all atheists. Atheism can't help you understand why there's a universe at all, but God can. Now, a philosopher who I think made this very clear somewhat later than Aquinas is Gottfried Wilhelm von Leibniz. And Leibniz proposed the principle of sufficient reason that I'd already mentioned. And according to the principle of sufficient reason, every fact needs a sufficient reason for that fact to be the case. The universe exists as a fact, demanding a reason for it to be the case. Now, as I said before, the principle of sufficient reason may not be a necessary truth itself, but it's surely metaphysically preferable to have a reason, to give a reason, than to give up on finding a reason. And I rather like this analogy that Leibniz has with geometry books. And I'm hearing some slightly extraneous noises. Sorry. So why do geometry books exist? And this is what Leibniz said. Let us suppose that a book of the elements of geometry existed from all eternity and that in succession one copy of it was made from another. It is evident that although we can account for the present book by the book from which it was copied, nevertheless, going back through as many books as we like, we could never reach a complete reason for it, because we can always ask why such books have at all times existed. That is to say, why books at all, and why written in this way. What is true of books is also true of the different states of the world, for in spite of certain laws of change, the succeeding state is in some sort a copy of that which precedes it. Therefore, to whatever earlier state you go back, you will never find in it the complete reason of things. That is to say, why there exists any world and why this world rather than some other. So it seems to me that God provides the explanation that we need. And what kind of explanation does God provide? Well, I would argue that God provides personal explanation rather than the kind of explanation that science provides, which is through scientific laws and initial conditions. An example of that is due to a chap called John Polkinghorne, who's very important figure in the modern science-religion discussion. And he said, well, suppose I go and put the kettle on. There will be a scientific explanation as to why the water boils in terms of bubbles forming and growing as the temperature rises and percolating upwards. But there's another explanation, a personal explanation. I want a cup of tea. And these two explanations are not in conflict, they are complementary. So to think about why am I here in the first place? Well, scientifically, I'm here because There's a personal story about my parents loving each other and wanting to share that love with a third person who reflects something of them. You can take that back to their parents before them. You can go generation after generation. You can go back to us descending from other creatures, ultimately bacteria in the primordial soup. Then you get to, well, the creation of the earth and the planets. They're here because the universe started with a big bang and so on. And you start to run out of explanations at that point. Indeed, the whole story has a personal explanation as well as a scientific one. Indeed, it seems to me that science isn't really answering the why question, what's that? And science answers the how. And so rival explanations in terms of science might be the Big Bang versus a steady state. But in terms of metaphysical explanations, metaphysical explanations, there might be the personal one that God made it. Or you might say, nobody made it, it just is, it's a brute fact. Or it's just a gigantic accident. They're rather similar, both atheistic 2 and 3 there. And indeed, 2 and 3 really don't provide an explanation. They say that the universe just exists as a brute fact, and that's something that we sort of have to accept. So, if I may just say, why then God created the universe? He would create it with intentions and purposes. He's eternal, all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing. And out of his overflowing love and creativity, he made the universe. He made it with the intention that it produce human creatures, creatures who are able to contemplate his handiwork, to have a relationship with him through prayer and worship. And his purpose would be that those creatures loved him and loved their neighbors. They looked after the world he'd created. Well, we may not have done that very well as creatures, but that was God's intention. And it seems that God explained too why science explained. It's not in competition with science. It explains why the scientific process was, which is what was God's way of achieving all that, is the way it is. God explains why there's a universe. It also explains why the universe is set up the way it is, with the result that we're here. And that takes me to the second point, the so-called fine-tuning that I discussed back in Istanbul. And as we discuss these problems, it seems to me that there are fundamental, ultimate questions that cosmology raises that take it beyond its own power to answer. And I will end with quoting again that wonderful sentence of Stephen Hawking. What indeed is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? I think I shall end at that point. So back to Emre, perhaps.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Do
you want to stop the sharing now? Shall I go back to that?
So, anybody who would like to ask a question about? So, how do we go, Dr. Bulgan?
So maybe we can give Enis.
Yep.
Enis, if you want, you can start.
Respondent, yes.
As respondent.
Yes, please. I'm very.
Thank you very much.
So,
it's an honor to be a respondent to Dr. Holder. So I agree with almost everything he said. So there's not really much objections I will make. I will just make a couple of points. Maybe he will agree with them or not. But first, as he pointed out with the case of Avicenna, it seems, while I do agree that beginning of the universe provides evidence for the existence of God, I don't think that if someday we have an opposite evidence, that is, if we show that universe is somehow eternal, it will be a counter evidence against theism. So we should, in my opinion, point out that theism is consistent with eternal universe. So after all, as Dr. Holder pointed out, some Christian and Muslim philosophers have defended the eternal creation. That is the idea that God has been creating the universe, or perhaps universes, since the eternity. So one can even acknowledge that our universe is finite, but say that God created some other universe, perhaps in some other space-time region, and God is creating internally. So eternal creation, in a sense, is consistent with theism. A second point, and this would be kind of like a small objection to one point which Holder did. He pointed out two philosophical arguments for beginning of the universe. One was the Hilbert's hotel, which is basically the claim that usually it is used to justify the claim that actual infinite cannot exist, and from that claim that universe must have a beginning. I have problem with that argument because that argument creates some problems for theism as well. So, for example, we believe that God's knowledge is infinite. So he's an omnipotent being. Of course, usually replies to say that God's knowledge is not propositional, that it is not divisible, but I'm not really sure that we can really say that. For example, we may ask these kind of questions. What's the number of geometrical theorems, or let's say theorems in arithmetic God can prove? No matter which finite number you give as an answer, it will be there will be a better answer. So God will be like limited. So the answer seems to be that God can prove all the theorems in arithmetic, and all the theorems, the number is actually infinite. Or let's take another example. Muslims usually believe that hell and heaven is eternal. At least heaven is eternal. I believe Christians also believe in that. And we also believe that God knows the future. So if God knows the future, and if future is infinite, then it cannot be potential infinite, because otherwise God should learn the future. If God knows, then there is a knowledge of actual infinite about future in God's knowledge. And it seems, again, we are committed in actual infinite. So I'm just skeptical on the claim that Hilbert's paradox is really a paradox. Yes, it certainly goes against intuitions, but that's how we define infinite. So subset is equivalent to the set itself. It's strange, but after all, God's attributes are also strange. So it seems like that's the only point I differ with Dr. Holder. All the other arguments I tend to agree with him. I will just point some couple of maybe additional points. So as at the end of his speech, Dr. Holder pointed out, I think Big Bang has an beginning of the universe have important implications. One of them is that it shows that scientism fails. So scientism says that we can give scientific explanation for everything, but if there is before the universe, it means there is before laws of nature, and as such, we cannot use laws of nature to explain the origin of the universe. So this actually itself shows that scientism fails. Another point is the universe being created from a single point is itself very interesting. So Big Bang points out that all the universe started from a single point, and this supports monotheism, especially like in Islam, we talk about tawhid or monotheism in general. So it seems that all the universe is causally connected to God, because everything in the universe is causally connected to Big Bang, and Big Bang is single point. So it kind of provides an argument from monotheism as well. So everything being connected with the God or the origin of the universe. So I think that's one important implication. So what else we can say? We could talk about the eschatology as well. So the fact that current cosmology also points out that universe not only has a beginning, but also has some kind of end. At least we can definitely say that life eventually will end. The earth will not be suitable for life. And this is again important confirmation of the belief both in Christianity and Islam that there will be day of judgment. That is, there will be a time at which life on earth will cease to exist. So that's actually another important theological implication of Big Bang theory, I think, which, or in general, universe having finite past. What else we can say? Of course, it gives a good additional argument for contingency argument. So if the universe has a beginning, it means universe could not have existed, which means universe is contingent. Again, it provides an indirect support for another, let's say, another argument for the existence of God. So these are the points I will share. Also, it can be used for natural theology to kind of defend some of the God's attributes. So in Islamic tradition, we believe that God is Al-Halik, that is, he's a creator, he's Al-Bari, he's the maker, he's Al-Musawwir, the fashioner. So all these attributes also seem to be vindicated by Big Bang cosmology. So that's all I will say, I guess. So thank you very much, Dr. Older. It was a really nice, enlightening speech.
May I say something? Thank you very much, Dr. Doko. That's a super response. Thank you. And I think you're right. That well, I mean, I'm really pleased that so much of what I said, resonates with you. That you agree with it. Yes, I think the Hilbert problem may be resolvable. Perhaps one thing on God's knowledge. Yes, we do think that God is omnipotent. God is knows, is omniscient. I suppose the only way one would qualify that would be to say that God knows everything that can be known, and that is an idea that is sometimes invoked in terms of debates about free will. People take different views about that, whether free will and determinism are compatible and so on. Many think that they are. Those who think they're not would go for what tends to be called a libertarian view of free will, where we have genuine choices, and if God knows beforehand that what we're going to do, then that choice is curtailed. That's a whole different sort of philosophical discussion, and a very tricky one. Because we do want to say that God has plans. God, is working things out in His creation, and despite all the mess that we make, He's going to bring good out of it in the end. So there's a whole debate to be had about that. How many theorems God can prove and so on. Well, I mean, there is an interesting point about human capacity as opposed to computers there, with the whole sort of discussion about Gödel's theorem. People like Roger Penrose think that we can know more than an algorithmic machine can know. So if we are more than computing machines, well, God is a whole heap more than us. So I think He can certainly know vastly more than we do. And I agree with what you've said about well, you did make the point that counter evidence to there being on an origin at the Big Bang wouldn't, we would still have an argument, as I described, and that scientism fails. Something that struck me when you were talking about God, the singularity, the point, and everything coming from that, and the unity of that coming from the one God. Something that struck me there is in medieval theology in the Christian world, there's the idea that creation participates in God. It itself is unified because it participates in the divine. And yes, I may just add that Christians believe in one God too. We might, how we express that might be slightly different, but yeah.
But in terms of a single point, I guess it's topologically different than.
Yeah.
So it can't be shrunk into a single point, right? So that's not.
Well, this is the debate, isn't it? Whether there is a real singularity. I mean, a lot of cosmologists have taken that, taken it that there is one, and the singularity theorem showing that, and so on. But as I say, when you get to infinite density, infinite, shrunk, everything shrunk to an actual geometric point, is that really physical?
And also when you go back in time, actually things become less closely connected than actual. So that's why it kind of, I think, undermines this unity.
Well, I think
everything united when you go back in time. I don't think that.
Right.
Yeah.
One of the things that inflation does is keep everything connected, though, as it were. That's part of the rationale for that theory.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and what do you think about the question in the chat about the? I think it's.
What have we got there?
Worth reading. If God, universe, yeah.
Yes, I think what I'm thinking though is the question says, if God created the universe, then this act must have occurred within a time frame, as creation is an action with a beginning and takes place within time. God has a notion of time. Yes, I think we have to say that God is outside time as we understand it. That time as we understand it comes, I wouldn't say God is out of logic laws, as the question says, but I think God's time is incomprehensible to us. I mean, Dr. Doko mentioned God seeing past, present, and future all at once. Well, that is very hard for us to kind of take in. So I think I would say that, as Augustine said, there is no time before time, and that God exists in eternity, but that is not the same thing as, if you like, everlasting time.
Julian has a question, I guess.
I have a question. If you Thank you very much, Rodney. It was a very nice presentation, by the way. So we know that it was not totally science, Aristotelian cosmology, right? So Aristotelian cosmology at that time maintained that the universe is eternal.
Indeed.
So basically, philosophers like Avicenna and other theistic philosophers had to find a suitable creation model, which is suitable for scientific cosmology in their time, right? And in the Middle Ages, maybe seemingly Islamic theologians, also some Christian theologians, were maybe against scientific cosmology in their time. At that time, they were having some difficulties. Of course, we know that eternality of the universe in philosophy has its own concepts. Contingency argument, for instance, can work without depending on any scientific considerations, we know.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, they at that time need to reconcile their philosophical argument and in their scientific considerations as well. Science and philosophy at that time was not separated. So, but what about today? If we maintain that our God concept requires that universe is eternal, because God always creates, God eternally creates. But how can we reconcile this theological argument with today's scientific cosmology? Can today's scientific cosmology justify that argument like in the Middle Ages? So, because we know that there's a Big Bang theory, also you thought that the universe is going to have an end. So how do we reconcile, if we consider our today's scientific cosmology, which implies that the universe has a beginning, our theological consideration, which says that God always creates, something like that, because we know that the earth is not eternal right now. The earth is not located in the center of the universe right now. Celestial bodies are not eternal. It was easy to reconcile eternality of the universe and God's eternal creation in the Middle Ages. But how do we reconcile right now if we consider modern cosmologic, scientific cosmology and eternality of the universe? Thank you again.
Thank you. You're right that Aristotle had an infinite universe with an infinite past history. And it's quite interesting that, of course, his philosophy was dominant, certainly in the theology of various medieval theologians, and in the Christian world, most especially Aquinas. Aquinas, I think, was trying to Christianize Aristotle, but Aquinas did believe that the universe, creation began, as I said, because that's what he read his scriptures as saying. But his argument for the existence of God didn't depend on that. The universe would need a creator if it had an infinite past too. Now you seem to be saying, actually, I think you seem to be preferring yourself now the infinite universe model, from what I was picking up there. That, but because then God would be always creating. So how do we square that with the science, which seems now to be saying the opposite of what Aristotle was saying? So I got you right. Yeah, that. Well, yeah. I think. I think what people like Aquinas would say is, that, of course, that God is doesn't have to be creating. The universe is not a necessary emanation from God or something like that. God freely creates. and he is self-sufficient in himself. I think I won't go into how Christians view the Trinity. That might not be appropriate, but there would be something in that about God being self-sufficient in God's self. So having no need for the creation, worshipped by angels or whatever, who precede the earthly creation. Don't know whether that helps on that. Difficult questions are coming.
I asked that question to my colleague at Marmara University. Okay, you are saying that the universe is eternal.
Yes. Did you know that
philosophically, and Avicenna and some philosophers maintain that the universe is eternal? But
yes, the person I quoted
that metaphysical idea in the Middle Ages, because at that time scientific cosmology, which was presented by Aristotelian cosmology, was suitable.
Yes.
But how could we establish right now? There was no universe 15 billion years ago, and maybe it's not going to be any universe 100 billion after. How could we say that God is always creating?
Well, indeed.
Cosmology doesn't say anything about that.
Yeah, I think I think in terms of eschatology, I think, yes, the universe, if left to its own devices, will die a heat death. That will be billions upon billions of years hence. And I think, life on Earth, from a cosmological point of view, has a limited term. Might be a few more billion years before the sun starts to expand and so on into a red giant, all that kind of thing. I think theologically we have to say that in terms of things like judgment and resurrection, that God will intervene at some point. I mean, it might be that we bring destruction on ourselves. I mean, we are damaging the planet. I realized that yesterday was I think it was the anniversary of the dropping of the Hiroshima bomb. We as humans are doing dangerous things, and I mean, the world may come to an end, long before the cosmological timescale is in effect. But I think God will, at some point, intervene, and there will be judgment, paradise, and so on.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question from the audience? Mesut Erzi. Yeah, please.
Thank you. It was very beneficial for me. My questions, when we talk about the universe, which questions is right questions? Why or how? Because you said the religions said why and science said how. So if our topic is universe, which questions is right questions, or are there any differentiation between how and why? And if we say how is enough, or we need ask both of questions to understand the universe. Thank you again.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. That's a good question. I think science can't tell us about things like purpose and meaning, not directly anyway. Science does ask, how things happen, how the world works, what are the laws of physics, or how does genetics work, or these are mechanisms that science is uncovering. But when we ask more existential questions like why are we here, what is the purpose of it all, then I think that we need theology, we need God. Otherwise, we're floundering in the dark. I think if we just try and invent our own meaning and purpose. I think there is real meaning and purpose, and it's to be found in God. It's to be found in His purposes for us and our lives as worshippers of God, and following God and following His commands and so on. That's how we fulfill our purposes. And so I don't think science answers that type of question, the meaning and purpose type of question. It doesn't answer the ethical question either. In terms of how we should behave, what experiment could you do to say that, to show that torturing babies is wrong? I mean, it's a different kind of question. So I think there are fundamental questions that science cannot answer. And I think the very interesting thing about cosmology as a science, though, is that it does push you up against the ultimate questions. It's about the origin and evolution of the universe, and it's discovering how the universe has come to be, how galaxies formed, stars formed, planets formed, and so on, how the elements formed inside stars. And biology takes over with how life got going, and so on and so on. But I think the idea that the universe had a beginning, that cosmology seems to point to, and even if it didn't, looking at the universe as a whole brings you up at the question, with the question, how come it's here? Why is it here? It points you beyond itself. And then why is it the way it is, so that we come into existence? I think science points beyond itself, particularly cosmology.
Thank you. And there's another question from the chat.
Sorry. I'm not hearing anything.
Can you see the question in the chat, or?
Oh, in the chat. Sorry, in the chat. Sorry. Possible time. We know time is done. Yes, I think the point I was making, I'm quite sure I'm understanding. I think what I'm saying, though, is actually time is actually different from space dimensions. And time, time, as the question says, is limiting, because there is a limit to the speed of light. And there are very interesting questions to do with relativity and time. There are parts of the universe where we will not have had any kind of possible contact. we have a definite past in a kind of light cone, where there are events which are in the past, which are causally connected to us, but then there are those which aren't, that we can't. There are galaxies beyond our horizon that we can't see yet because time hasn't. There's not been time for light to reach us from those galaxies beyond ours. We think the universe extends beyond our immediate horizon, as it were, very long way, billions of light years. But we do believe there is more beyond it, beyond what we can actually see. But we could get a surprise the further and further away things are.
Maybe I can ask something a little bit more, what should I say? I don't know whether it's called technical or not, but do you think religion says anything about the behavior of space and time in terms of its being emergent?
Ooh, well, I'm not sure that religion or theology can really comment on that. And you've got to ask that if space and time emerge from something, that is deeply mysterious.
Like some people believe that space might be, but time can't because time is more fundamental or something. Like, is there any like religious base on differentiating the two in terms of they being emergent? That's what I meant. Like,
I don't think I can think of anything on the religious front. I mean, like I said before earlier, time measures change, and it's if there isn't real time, it's difficult to see how change occurs. I mean, what is it emerging from? People try and get, well, I suppose, the Hartle-Hawking theory is something like that. It's supposed to emerge from the four-dimensional space, but it's hard to see, the four-dimensional space has a real ontological existence or meaning. Probably not helping you much on that one.
Thank you. Any further question from the audience before I make it even more technical? God does live in 11 dimensions, and
string theory, yeah. Well, string theory, the name theory and all that. Well, that's just one of the options we have for quantum gravity. But again, I think one of the problems with cosmology at the moment is that we're getting fantastic observations, and of course we've got this new James Webb telescope and all that. But the theory is outstripping the experiment and the observations in some areas. We don't, as I say, we've got these things like Hawking-Hartle theory, but string theory, but we don't have a quantum gravity that's been tested that has, that you can even test in the laboratory, I think, at the moment.
I think I was able to trigger some questions from Enis. Yeah, Enis, please.
No, I was going to make a small comment about your question with space-time. So it seems to me that actually in theology also time may be a little bit more important than space.
Yeah.
Why? Because it's very rare for theologians to think that God is inside space. It may be an exception of Jesus if you are Christian, but usually we think God as spaceless, like outside of the space. But when it comes to time, opinions change. Like there are theologians who think that God is in time. Of course, it need not be a physical time. He may have his own metaphysical time. But this kind of, if God has a temporal part, this makes time more special compared to space, because God shares the time, maybe with us, or he has his own special temporal dimension, or let's say temporal life. You can find this in Islamic tradition as well. Ibn Taymiyyah and some Salafi scholars tend to think that God is in time, while they would not say that usually that God is in space. Some will say that, like literalists, but very rare among theologians to say that God is in space. So, yeah.
That is very interesting. I think someone in the Christian world who would say that God is in time, interestingly enough, would be Richard Swinburne, who was speaking in Istanbul in May. I think he finds the idea of God being outside time rather hard to understand, which it is, because we are talking about some kind of God's own sort of metaphysical time. I think you used the word.
Another question from the chat again.
Yes, do the two disciplines answer the same question? I think what I'm saying is that the science almost drives you to asking the questions that it can't answer. It takes you to sort of, you see, I mean, there's God gets discussed an awful lot in popular science books, not least in Hawking's Brief History of Time. He says at the end, when we have this wonderful, marvelous physical theory of everything that he was looking for, then we shall know the mind of God. So I think there is an interrelationship between the disciplines. They don't answer the same question, but they are interrelated. And for a full view of the world, a complete view, then I think you need both.
And I think there was another question from Nursena Çetingil, right?
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Halder. My question maybe shift the subject a little bit, but I want to ask, well, I'm finding a person like you who is expertise in both philosophy and physics. Well, I'm wondering whether you heard Roger Penrose's quantum conscious theory. It's called OR-core theory. He developed it with a medical doctor named Stuart Hameroff. Well, I'm wondering that how serious taken this theory in scholar circle. So what do you think about it if you heard it? Thank you so much.
I didn't quite catch what you're saying, but I think you're referring to a theory that Penrose has about the human mind and body, a relationship and so on. And I think it all stems from his, and there's some sort of quantum effect that he thinks is involved in humans exercising rationality and free will. I know not very much about this, but my feeling is that it isn't thought very much of in the biological world. But I would stand to be corrected, but I think that would be the view. It is interesting when people sort of stray beyond their area of expertise. I think, Penrose is a brilliant mathematician and cosmologist. Hawking was a brilliant cosmologist, a genius. But when he started talking about philosophy, well, he opens his book, The Grand Design, by saying that philosophy is dead, and spends most of the rest of the book doing philosophy, as far as I can tell. You know, model-dependent realism, what's that if it isn't a philosophical position that he describes he holds?
Even when it comes to physics, it's not, his ideas are not mainstream, even for cosmology, as you know.
No, yeah. I mean, some of his ideas, certainly some of his ideas are. I mean, his, black hole work and so on. I think that's pretty mainstream now.
Cyclic universes and this and that.
Yeah, no, I agree about that. Yes.
But interesting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Any further question? Okay. I think if not, thank you, Dr. Holder.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure and lovely to see some faces I recognize again. That's really super. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Thank you too.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, everyone.